specifically targets supports towards children, young people and their families who are most at risk of poverty and deprivation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chief Executive of the Family Resource Centre National Forum, and I'm also a member of the board of the Children's Rights Alliance. First, today, we are delighted to have an input by Minister for Social Protection, Darragh Calleary. Minister Calleary, unfortunately, isn't able to attend this morning in person. I met him yesterday at the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Summit, and he was very disappointed that he couldn't join us in person. But he has recorded a video address for the event. We'll then hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Following the keynote, we will have a panel discussion with the speakers who are joining me in person here today. Our panelists today will offer insights from members and key stakeholders about the impact inadequate income supports have on children and families across the country. There will be a Q&A session at the end where you will have the opportunity to participate and to raise questions with our panel here today. The Children's Rights Alliance team will be sharing key messages on social media this morning, and we encourage you all to add your voice to the discussion online by using the hashtag #EndChildPovertyWeek and #Children'sBudget. We want to bring as much attention in this discussion and add as many voices as possible so we can make Budget 2026 a children's budget. So now we're going to go to the special address from Minister for Social Protection, Darragh Calleary.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity. I want to thank Children's Alliance for the work to End Child Poverty Week, now in its 4th year. Today, throughout all of this week, and indeed throughout all of the year, we are reminded of the urgency in addressing the challenges that are facing too many children, too many families across Ireland. I want to thank the Children's Rights Alliance for the publication of your most recent Child Poverty Monitor in June. This is a hugely important resource to me to inform discussion and policy on this crucial area. Yesterday, the Taoiseach hosted the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Summit. I joined 3 of my government colleagues for a panel discussion where we answered questions from young people themselves about how we will support, empower, and enable children and young people now and indeed into the future. The Taoiseach was also writing in yesterday's Irish Independent about how now is the time to act on child poverty and that it will be targeted in Budget 2026, and I will deliver on that. The summit and the activities that have taken place this week for End Poverty Week will inform the government's consideration of measures to reduce child poverty, including for Budget 2026 and future budgets. Until the release of the CSO survey on income and living conditions in March 2025, consistent poverty in children have been on a downward trend. It peaked in 2013 at 12.7%, fell to its lowest level in 2023 at 4.8%, before increasing significantly in 2024 to 8.5%. This data is very disappointing, but it is important to recognise that the most recent data is based on 2023 income data. It doesn't reflect the government's full response to child poverty in recent years. Overall, the last 2 budgets each contained the largest social welfare packages in the history of the state, highlighting our determination to drive down poverty rates for children. Social protection measures provided in Budget 2025 alone amounted to €2.6 billion. Those increases have not yet been included in the latest CSO poverty statistics, which are based on 2023 income levels. However, I do know, and I will determined, much more needs to be done. And as the Taoiseach said at the National Economic Dialogue in June, child poverty is not inevitable. Under the Programme for Government, we have committed to continuing our work to address poverty and social inclusion, and we have a number of important commitments in relation to child poverty. The work of the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office in the Department of the Taoiseach is a key step in driving action as well as planning on this issue. This week, the Taoiseach and I published a new child poverty target in line with our programme for government commitment and the commitment in our national strategy to reduce poverty, the roadmap for social inclusion. This new target is to achieve 3% or less child consistent poverty, which measures at risk of poverty and deprivation, to achieve that by the end of 2030. The target was developed following a public consultation last year. It is ambitious, reflecting a potential reduction of 5.5% from the current rate of 8.5%. It will not be achieved unless we have a whole of government focus. Nobody wants to see any child in poverty in Ireland. That is my end goal. The purpose of the target is to guide and to maintain a strong and coordinated focus over the lifetime of the government, cross-government policies and measures, and to ensure investment is targeted at each child who needs it the most. We will report on this new child poverty target in the forthcoming new roadmap for social inclusion, which my department is currently developing, and which will, for the first time, have a key focus on child poverty. In addition, the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office in the Department of the Taoiseach is developing a dashboard of indicators for child wellbeing, which will allow for the measurement of child poverty in a far more holistic manner, whilst tracking progress on key metrics. Government has been very clear that tackling child poverty is a priority for this government. It will be a key factor in framing next month's budget, as well as future government priorities. Given the complex and multifaceted nature of child poverty, a whole of government focus is essential to reduce child poverty and to meet that new target. Along with targeted income supports for families and children, we need continued and targeted actions in relation to employment, to housing, to health, to childcare, and to education. All of this will require a significant investment, not just over one budget, but over the lifetime of this government. Today's focus is on income. We know the effectiveness of targeted income supports to reduce child poverty, and this is why payment rates of child support payment and the weekly thresholds of the working family payment were increased significantly in Budget 2025, amongst other measures such as the increase in the back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance. These payments provide targeted assistance directly linked to household income and thereby supporting low-income families with children, and they are paid to qualified households in addition to the universally paid child benefit. If we look at the child support payment in particular, its primary objective is to support low-income households with children in addition to a social welfare payment. As of August 2025, almost 330,000 people were in receipt of the payment, equivalent to a weekly expenditure of approximately €15 million. Non-income supports and services are a key part of the response to reduce child poverty. This includes the expansion of the Hot School Meals programme to all primary schools, with over 550,000 eligible children, free school books for children, as well as a holiday meals programme which took place for the first time this past summer. However, I'm very serious and acknowledge that we have much more work to do to drive down child poverty, to ensure that every single child in Ireland has the best start in life. My department is currently considering further approaches to ensure that resources that are directed to families with children in the most needed support. The work is ongoing and will be considered as part of Budget 2026 measures. As I said previously, a whole of government approach to child poverty is needed in other areas such as housing, childcare, health and education. If we are to meaningfully tackle child poverty, all of these measures will need significant investment, commitment, and most importantly, delivery over the lifetime of this government. This is my key message to you today. It is the key message of the department, and it will be our key driver as we enter into negotiations for Budget 2026 and beyond. By targeting our supports and by working across government and keeping a clear focus, I am confident and I'm determined that we will make inroads and meaningfully tackle child poverty. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you. Gormina Maghrib go gach duine atá gobar ar an over Harveh Hovatach seo agus gaum gach gratis.
Okay, I want to thank Minister Calleary for that input, and for recording that for us for today. I'm going to go to our panel now, just to get some initial reaction to Minister Calleary's video. So I'll go with you first, Helen.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm I suppose pleased to see the introduction of the new child poverty target. We haven't had one for a while, and I think it's really important to have that public commitment and that monitoring. We know from other countries as well that having those targets is important. I would like to see the other range of measures or the other range of the dashboard of measures that the minister talked about, because I think it's important not just to have one target, but to I suppose to capture the multi-dimensional nature of poverty. We need to probably go beyond that as well. I also think it's important and would welcome that whole of government approach. I think it was really heartening to see, the different ministers at the Poverty Summit yesterday, and to have the Taoiseach and have that unit at the heart of government. I think is important, because we can have lots of plans, but we really need to see the implementation as well. So I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my own perspective, I think historically, sometimes there's been very ambitious policy, but a deficit in implementation, and sometimes there can be a sense of fragmentation across government, different government departments in relation to a policy goal. So I do think that cross-government approach is encouraging. Louise, have you any initial reaction to the minister's video?
Yes, I'm very pleased to see the child poverty targets announced. It's something we've been looking for a long time, so it's great to see that. I do want to see some, and we haven't got it yet, but I'm hoping to see coming some idea of how that will be implemented, but not just implemented, how there will be accountability. Will we have the minister standing up before the Dáil once a year or towards the committee explaining what has been achieved year on year and year? I'm conscious that, we have the Lisbon Treaty that talks about, ending homelessness by 2030, but we're now in 2026 almost, and we haven't seen that reduction. And it is about having a plan and then seeing accountability at every stage of that plan. I would love to see, obviously, some legislation around ensuring that every budget is child-proofed, and it's something we have called in the SVP. But, from an initial point of view, it's great to see the target, and now let's see the details behind it.
Okay, thanks, Louise. And Niall, have you any reaction yourself?
Just maybe a bit of an insight. Since the first day I met the minister, he told me child poverty was a key priority for himself and the Taoiseach, that it would be a focus. So that's a very genuine reflection. It's a consistent message he's brought since he's joined us as Minister for Social Protection. I think, obviously, I'm not going to disagree with a single word the minister said, but I think he summed it up very well. He's confident and he's determined. We have a very ambitious new child poverty target, and this budget is going to have a focus, as the Taoiseach said yesterday at the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Summit, on tackling child poverty. But I'm also conscious what Mike Ryan said yesterday at the summit, that this is a never-ending process. It's a constant battle to reduce child poverty. So it won't be achieved in one budget. It'll be over, as the minister said, it'll be a focus over the lifetime of the government, and it will go beyond that. This is something we have to keep tackling, because if you don't, we see what happens in recent times.
And do you feel like is the current climate conducive to that kind of multi-annual planning, where you can go beyond the 26 budget and into future budgets?
Well, that's about political commitments. So the budget process isn't going to change. So the approach we have in terms of the measures we'll be looking at in terms of budget 2026, we're working on at the moment. We won't be looking at, obviously there'll be other issues to be dealt with each subsequent budget that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, and in fairness, something Mike Ryan said yesterday as well at the Child Poverty Summit was that income alone is not a sole kind of thing to focus on in the context of child poverty. And he spoke about the kind of holistic well-being, which is obviously why that dashboard of indicators has come in. Do you feel like, you know, that cross-departmental approach that your colleagues in other departments are on board with this goal as well?
I think you saw the reflection yesterday of so many cabinet ministers attending a high-profile event and giving it a very strong focus. The Taoiseach Cabinet Committee has said the same message that was said yesterday in terms of the Cabinet Committee on Children. This is his priority. So I do think that message has been received, and talking with colleagues in other government departments, they're aware of the Taoiseach and the government's priorities.
Yeah, and there's a subcommittee of cabinet focused on social policy, isn't there? And that's something that would look at this area.
There's a designated Cabinet Committee on Children and Education.
Okay.
And the issue of child poverty and measures from multiple government departments, including my own, feature in relation at that Cabinet Committee.
Very good. Thanks, Niall. Okay, are we ready to go to? No. Okay, so we maybe we'll press on. We're just waiting on Olivier now, who's traveling this morning. So we're waiting for him to get to his destination, our next speaker. So we'll maybe talk a bit more now and go into more detail on the panel discussion. So before we do that, because I'm conscious we heard from our panel there without me giving them an introduction, I'm going to give you a more detailed introduction now for each member of our panel. So Louise Bayliss is the Head of Social Justice and Policy in Society of St. Vincent de Paul. She is a leading advocate for children's rights, housing and income adequacy. She's a founding member of SPARC, which is Single Parents Acting for the Rights of Kids, and she's chair of TROR. With a long track record of campaigning for lone parents and families experiencing poverty, Louise's work combines lived experience, policy expertise, and a deep commitment to social justice. She also told us this morning she's writing a book. I hope you don't mind me creating that level of expectation in the general public, Louise, but there is a fictional book in the pipeline. We're also joined by Professor Helen Russell, who's research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute, the ESRI. Helen is head of the Social Research Division. She holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Oxford. And before joining the ESRI in 1998, she was a prize research fellow at Nuffield College, University of Oxford. Her research covers a range of interconnecting issues relating to employment, equality, and social inclusion. We're also joined by Dr. Niall Egan, Assistant Secretary General of the Department of Social Protection. And he has responsibility for the corporate division in the department, with responsibility for the department's budget, legislation, statistics, and communications functions. He also has responsibility for social inclusion and labour market policy in the department. Okay, so Niall, I'm going to go back to you now. I'm conscious I was just speaking with you, but as the cost of living increases in conjunction with the national minimum wage, families living just below the poverty line have found themselves impacted as they no longer meet the income threshold, but continue to struggle with daily costs. And we heard more about that, actually. I heard on the news on the way up this morning in relation to further cost of living pressures. How can we work to ensure support such as the working family payment remain accessible to those in need?
Thanks, Fergal. So obviously we all would have seen the CSO's statistics on food price inflation. And we're also very conscious in the Department of Social Protection that the people who rely on social welfare payments pay a higher level of actual inflation than the general population. So we are very aware within the department the importance of ensuring that social welfare recipients and low-income families have enough income in order to be able to meet basic needs, but also to give a good quality of life. And that's why I think the government established not just a child poverty unit within the Department of Taoiseach, but a child poverty and wellbeing unit. Specifically, Fergal, in relation to your question, we are very aware, based actually on research that the ESRI did for the Department of Social Protection, the effectiveness of some of our measures and which measures are more effective at lifting people out of poverty. And the working family payment is one of the most effective tools we have at our disposal. And we have increased the income thresholds in the last 3 budgets in relation to that. And it's really important we continue to do that to keep pace with growth in earnings, to avoid a situation that you've described of people lift over the threshold. So it is one of the areas we're actively looking at in the context of the budget preparations. Obviously, I can't give any commitments, but we are very conscious its effectiveness at reducing and lifting people out of poverty, but also reducing in-work poverty as well.
Okay. And there was some discussion at the Child Poverty Summit yesterday in relation to the proposal for a two-tier approach to child benefit. I mean, again, not going ahead because I'm conscious we can't go ahead of the budget day itself, but in comparison, I suppose, at the different measures in terms of using existing measures and increasing existing payments that are already targeted versus introducing a whole new system. What's your own view in relation to that?
Well, there's a programme for government commitment to explore the second tier child benefits. So we have had discussions with our colleagues in the SRI about their proposal. I think we need to do more discussions, and we need to really get under the bonnet of what is being proposed. It's really important that the measures we take don't have unintended consequences. We need to really properly scope out who is impacted for good and who is impacted for adversely, exactly. And given the numbers of people involved, given a very ambitious child poverty target, that's critical. What we also heard yesterday at the Child Poverty Summit, the call to action from the Taoiseach was very clear. He wants action now. And that means we have to use the levers that are at our disposal. And if we want to make an immediate impact in terms of child poverty, the first thing we have to do is use those levers. So whether that be, as the Minister had said, working family payment, child support payment, or other measures within the department's remit, I think they will be the focus in terms of budget 2026. But it will require detailed planning in relation to what may a second tier look like. And that will require policy and political decisions in terms of its structure, and there's an awful lot of detail that has to be worked out in relation to that.
Okay. Louise, consistently we see in statistics that one-parent families are experiencing increased forms of deprivation. What kind of investments do you think can be made to address that particular issue?
Well, you kind of raised the point earlier, Fergal, in the question to Niall there. One of the things that we would look at is to make sure that if there's an increase in the minimum wage, that also thresholds are increased in the exact same level. So I'll give an example, and I will admit, you know, I think the working family payment has been effective, and it has been adjusted in line with minimum wage over the last few years. You know, it's been €60 increases per child, which has been really effective. It's about €36 a week it works out. So that's been really good. But the same thing hasn't been happening to, say, one-parent family allowance or job seekers transition. And I'll give an example. So when that was introduced in 1997, there was no minimum wage, but by 2000 there was a minimum wage. And the income disregard, which was the amount you could earn before your social welfare was cut, was the equivalent of 26 hours minimum wage, which was absolutely perfect. It meant that a lone parent who could work during her child's school hours could get the full social welfare and actually get 26 hours pay, lift them out of poverty. It was a very, very effective tool. However, if we look today and we analyse it at the same level, the income disregard is now €165 compared to €147.60 back in 1997. Today, that income disregard is the equivalent of 12.22 hours as opposed to 26 hours. So even if a lone parent is doing the same part-time work that she would have been in 20 years ago, she's not going to lift herself out of poverty. And that's, I think, is where we need not just these incremental increases year on year. We need legislation or some type of agreement that if the increases are aligned to any increase in minimum wage, and that would keep the value going.
Just so I get this right, Louise, because I wouldn't be as in the detail as much as you. In some ways, one hand of government is quite rightly increasing the minimum wage,
which is great.
but that's having an impact on your eligibility for a payment given by another element of government. So
exactly. So what we need is them aligned, and if we had that alignment together, it would really help lone parents who are trying to do part-time hours, trying to avoid childcare, but would help lift them out of poverty.
So every time the minimum wage goes up, so should the income disregard. Sorry,
has not gone up. I mean, it's gone up.
It
hasn't, exactly. As I said, it came in 1997. The income disregard was €147.60. It's now €165. I think we could all say over the course of 28 years, is my maths right? I think it is. That €20 is not going to cut it.
No. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add from the perspective of lone parents?
Well, lone parents, as you said, are at the threshold. If you're looking at child poverty, I think we really need to start talking about child poverty in lone parent households. That's where they're child poverty is. You know, we're looking at child poverty increasing, the deprivation rate or the consistent poverty rate that the minister referenced, and he did say it went from 4.8% to 8.5%, which was quite shocking in a year. However, we've got to break it down if we're really going to look at what child poverty is. You know, the general population, the consistent poverty rate is 5%. For children in two-parent families with 1 to 3 children, it's 6%. So it's not that much different than what it is in the general population. For children overall, it's 8.5%, but that's really being driven by the fact that it's children in no-parent households that have the highest consistent poverty rate. Their rate is 11%, more than double what it is in the general population. So what we need to make sure is that we're looking at supports for lone parents, because that's where the poverty is. And I would just say it would be very easy to reduce child poverty by looking at those just teetering on the margins of under, you know, the poverty threshold. You know, you could lift a lot by lifting them over the poverty at quite an easy way. However, I would like to say it's not just about lifting numbers, it's about lifting those more deeply in poverty, in the lowest decile of percentages, and lifting them up. It's not just about lifting those the things. So I'd be focusing on deep poverty, because we could easily, not easily, I'm sure, but even Niall is looking, oh, it's not easy to end child poverty.
No, but you could achieve improvement, and then if circumstances change, for example, in the wider economy, that could just dip back down.
Exactly. Yeah, but also I'm saying if you could lift children who are on the margins of poverty quite easily, you know, with targeted measures, but you're still not touching those in deepest poverty, those poorest. And I think if we really want a fair and equal society, we need to start at the bottom and start lifting them up.
Okay. Thank you. Now I just got a sense, did you want to come back in there on anything that was said there, or?
No, like Louise makes perfectly really valid points, and in fairness to Louise, she has made this point very strongly at our pre-budget forum and in the St. Vincent de Paul submission to our budget process. We're very aware.
And at the social inclusion meetings.
Well, and at our Roma for Social Inclusion steering group. So, like, absolutely, I completely agree. But from our perspective, there are difficult choices. That's what budgets are about. We don't have unlimited resources, unfortunately. We have had to make priority choices given the envelope we're given each year. But like, I don't disagree exactly in terms of what Louisa said. We have made some improvements in relation to the lone parents, but not enough. We're the first to admit that. But it is something, obviously, it is on our list of issues to look at. But it is it's about priorities, and I think what we can say is very clearly what the government priorities are for this year in terms of focusing on children.
Okay. Thanks, Niall. Helen, research published by you and the ASRI colleagues at the start of the summer highlighted that there's a cohort of children that are experiencing deprivation but are not at risk of poverty. This indicates that interventions beyond income supports are important to addressing poverty. And I suppose I'm interested in this from a family resource centre perspective, because family resource centres work in a lot of communities with people who are experiencing deprivation. And I suppose we have a real commitment as a programme to kind of working long-term and intergenerationally to change that. So what do we know about the income situations of these households, and what measures could be introduced in Budget 2026 to ensure support to these families?
Yeah, so we looked at this group. So obviously a lot of our research and policy focuses on low income, and partly that's because, you know, it's quantifiable and it's, you know, it's easy to measure, and we can see a straightforward kind of impact if we spend on certain areas. So, but there is a sizable group of children and families who are deprived but are not income poor, so they're not below the poverty line, and you know, this is a matter of concern, right? Because that measure of deprivation is people who are, you know, unable to afford basic necessities or services that are considered the norm in society. So we saw as well that the size of that group was getting bigger in recent years. So it's about 16% of children in 2023. So in terms of their characteristics and their incomes, so we found actually quite a big proportion of them were just above the poverty line. So about a third had incomes between 60 and 70% of the median income, and about half were between that and 80%. So they're not far above the poverty line. We also found that actually, if you look at housing costs, that a significant proportion, about 4 in 10, had were in poverty after housing costs were considered. So, and this is something that we also emphasised in our report earlier this week.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so children and their families are amongst the group most likely to have very high housing costs. So they have they're overrepresented in the rental sector, and they're also the group, I suppose, that are likely to have high mortgage costs. So when we look at after housing costs, there's a big increase in that group. We also see this deprived non-income poor group. The lone parents are really overrepresented, as are households where there is a person with a disability. The other characteristic, I suppose, was that they were also very like the consistently poor in terms of their arrears, and actually were the group most likely to say that their household had problems with non-household debt. So these are the kind of the reasons why you might have an income that's above the poverty line, but actually it's not enough to make ends meet, because you either have debts or you have costs, like the additional costs of disability or the additional costs of being a lone parent.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like, I mean, in some ways, this, without generalizing, it's the same cohort. It's just that one group falls on one side of a definition that we've come up with in relation to consistent poverty, and one falls on the other side. But really, the issues around lone parent households, people with a disability, the impact of the housing crisis on them are broadly similar.
Yes, so there is a lot of overlap, and yes, because they're just above the poverty line, it could well be that if you go back to them next year, they're just above, or but they switch in between those. So I think in terms of you asked about what the supports are, so a lot of the income supports are obviously still very relevant, because they are they do still have low income. But obviously then the wider range of sports. So it's harder to target deprivation per se, but we do it in some of our policies. So saying something like the DESH, the scheme for schools in disadvantaged areas. So we do it by area, and we have these SICAP schemes, the social inclusion schemes. So those sort of interventions are really important, I suppose, to reach children.
The theme of this week, I think, from some of the other child rights events, there's kind of a term has been coined of DESH Plus, of kind of furthering that strategy of targeting.
And I think that's really important, and it's kind of an example of policy that has been really successful in Ireland. Obviously, there's still a lot of educational inequalities in Ireland, but actually, the DESH model, where more resources are going into disadvantaged school, has been really important, and it's really made an impact in terms of the early school leaving rates. So I think it's a good example of when we put a policy focus on something, we can make a difference. So I think that DESH Plus and the DESH in preschool is important as well. So that's having something similar at preschool level is important.
Okay. I don't want to leave this point maybe, but just talking a bit more about housing. I mean, if anybody wants to say it, but it's just come up there naturally about the impact that housing has on the cohort that we're speaking about, whether that's people living in consistent poverty or people in deprivation. Louisa, I know you've been a strong advocate in relation to housing for many years. So.
I have, and also, housing obviously is difficult for any household, but if you're doing it on one income, it's extremely difficult. And I would say, if we look at the homeless figures in the last 6 months, we're looking at a homeless crisis that is mainly now driven by children and lone parents and families. So if we look at the increase in homelessness in the last 6 months, there was an increase of 772 individuals. 742 were made up of families and 30 were made up of single adults. So I think we need to get that out there, because I think there is this perception that homelessness in Ireland is single adults, but it's actually not, it's families. So the 742 increase in individuals becoming homeless, out of that about 450 are children. And the majority of them are lone parent households. So in every aspect, what we're seeing is there's a group being failed, and it is children.
Okay. Now, do you want to say anything on that? I mean, I'm conscious it must be challenging to be in a leadership role in a department where you're trying to achieve a certain objective, and other kind of things going on in society and in the economy have a direct impact on what you're trying to achieve.
Well, that's the nature of the department's work. So obviously, you know, what Louise and Helen have said about housing and affordability, if a family doesn't have secure, affordable housing, it's very difficult to build supports around that family. And the supports might be employment supports to assist a lone parent, access employment, and the childcare that needs to go with that. If that family is moving on a regular basis between emergency homeless accommodation or are in sustainable accommodation, it's very difficult to support that family. But I know the Department of Housing and Minister Brown announced a new initiative this week to specifically try and target additional resources at families. So that.
Yeah, and I think what he announced was 50 million allocated, 50 million that would be used to buy properties for families stuck in emergency accommodation, which is extremely welcome. You know, I would welcome that 100% because we know there are families stuck in emergency accommodation for 2 years plus because they have too many children to fit into the, you know, the normal 2-bed apartments that are available. However, it has to be said that one of the main drivers of poverty because of the housing crisis are HAP top-ups. And, you know, that has to be fixed because any increases you give in your department are being eaten up by HAP top-ups. And I think until we get that, housing is going to have a severe impact on people's poverty, and that's reflected in the work that you, Soraya, are doing, that, you know, you have to, if you're looking at poverty measurements and deprivation, you have to include housing costs into that, and top-ups, HAP top-ups to landlords is really causing deprivation among families.
Absolutely, and I think I've always found it very helpful. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of the Children's Rights Alliance to take a rights-based approach to this, and children's rights under the UNCRC for optimal survival and optimal development. And I think it was Charlotte from Good Shepherd spoke yesterday at the summit around how difficult it is to even envisage that when a family are living in emergency accommodation that is inherently intended for short term, and or IPAS, which I know is a feature of what we're concerned about here today as well, those types of environments, it makes it almost impossible for a parent, let alone the state, to facilitate a child's development in that kind of context. So I think it's important that we mention that. Now, I do want to talk about some research that was commissioned by the Children's Rights Alliance on new public polling in advance of End Child Poverty Week, which showed huge public support for targeted income supports for children in low-income families. And I suppose I want to confess having an assumption here. I would have had an assumption that kind of the general public might have been resistant in some ways to this idea of targeted. And in some ways I had an intuition that that's why it hasn't happened heretofore, because there might be sort of popular resistance to it. But this research shows that that's not actually the case, that the majority of people are actually in favour and actually want the government to prioritise this. So I just wanted to throw it out if anybody wanted to comment on that polling. Anyone from the panel want to say anything?
I just would like to say I think it's really uplifting and enlightening to hear it, because last year what we saw in the year of an election was double child benefit payments made twice, instead of the targeted payment that would have really helped lift children out of poverty. So, and I think that was made on a political basis, and on the basis that they thought people would like a few euro extra in their pay packet. But I think the reality is, in Ireland, despite all the things that we hear negatively, most people genuinely do want fairness and equality, and nobody wants to think of a child going to bed hungry. And it really is really uplifting to hear that, and I welcome the polling results, and gives you faith, because there's so much negativity in the world at the moment. So when you break it down, people can say all this rhetoric and social media, whatever, but when you break it down, people want fairness and equality, and that really is a nice message.
And it was interesting to kind of see the dynamic between Minister Chambers yesterday and the other ministers who were part of the panel in the Child Poverty Summit, where I think at one point he said there can only be one number one priority. So decisions need to be made to prioritise one thing that might indeed be politically popular over another thing that might actually be more effective based on research and evidence, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, yes. So I mean, the work that we were talking about earlier, that our colleagues have done, looking at the impact of different interventions, and they clearly show in line with what the poll is showing, is the targeted interventions are really important. So if you increase universal benefits, like it costs a lot of money, but you don't get the same impact. So those, the second tier of child benefit, which they tested, was the one that had the biggest impact in terms of reducing the proportion in poverty. And also Louise was mentioning the depth of poverty, and that was also the measure that was most effective in terms of lifting the very bottom group out of poverty. So I think if we're going to reach these ambitious targets, it is going to involve transferring or ensuring that there's a big increase in income amongst poor families. So that has to be either done with, target supports, increases in labour market income, or a big increase in services, so that people's expenditure is lower. But I think the targeted interventions are the ones that are going to be.
There was a lot of discussion about that yesterday, and I suppose I'm thinking more on the services side. Over the years, I came from being a child protection social worker to being very interested in prevention and early intervention. So I've always been an advocate of sort of progressive universalism, where there's sort of a sense of solidarity within society, and that common public services like our primary school system and everything are common to all. But it's kind of that sophistication of targeting from within that, I think, so that you don't have stigmatizing supports, that everybody receives kind of a certain level of universal support, but the targeting through that seems...
Which is what happens with the National Childcare Scheme.
Yes, yeah, okay. And like I have 3 young kids myself. I'm looking at you, Niall, and we got the energy credits, we get child benefit. Obviously, my children, I think, come to me most Sunday evenings to look at the menu for the school meals to see what they want to kind of tweak in the forthcoming week. And look, I can see a certain benefit in that, but I also see that I'm in a privileged situation, yet I'm receiving these supports. What's your own view on that balance between targeting and universalism?
Well, that progressive universalism, like that is the gold standard. If you look at a lot of EU research conducted by people who used to work in the Combat Poverty Agency in Ireland, actually consistently pointed that is where societies should aspire to. It's the Scandinavian model of provision. It's really important, particularly in a school setting, that only the children who are deemed deprived don't get a school meal, and therefore identified by their classmates. So that's the benefit of the school meals and being able to roll out a support. People aren't always easily identifiable who are deprived. Right? There could be chaotic circumstances. From your previous background, from a social worker perspective, that those children most at need sometimes aren't the people we're talking about. So we have to have being able to provide supports in a way that are targeted, and that has been a very clear message this week. I agree with that. But I would also point out the last budget from my department, 2.6 billion, as the Minister has said, 2.3 billion of that was targeted. So we had a €12 rate increase in social welfare. That's the third successful rate increase of that magnitude. Be the highest level ever of an increase in the child support payment for over 12s at €8, €4 for under 12s. Again, an incredibly targeted measure. We also had the working family payment increase of €60. So that's 154 increase over the last 3 budgets in working family payment. We had lump sum payments and double payments for social welfare recipients, working family payment recipients, and those who were in receipt of child support payments as well. So there were targeted measures there. I think what government have said this week, we want to be more targeted in the context of budget 2026. So as ever, it's about finding the balance, and I think we got our clear instructions this week.
Yeah, okay, and we can't cover everything today, and I'm conscious of that. I think with in that the comparison to the gold standard, I think it's worth mentioning. I think a kind of universal health system that some other countries have, I suppose, a full implementation of what we're calling Sláintecare. So I just want to mention, but I appreciate we can't cover in detail. But family resource centres, when I went out to our network today, we're talking about children they're working with who are on waiting lists for key services from the HSE, whether that's disability services or CAMHS. So that's another external factor that's non-income related, that's impacting on children and families. And when I say it's non-income, again, certain families can afford to pay for assessments and to pay for therapies that others can't. So it interacts with income. So I think that kind of idea of having a gold standard of public service provision that provides a floor in relation to service delivery has a big impact on the welfare of children and families as well. But I'm also very conscious that we slightly amended our program today because Olivier de Schutter was traveling, and we're very impressed with the public transport that he was on because he's at his destination now. So I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, Professor Olivier de Schutter, who is UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Professor de Schutter was appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights by the UN Human Rights Council in March 2020. An academic specialized in economic and social rights, he is also currently a member of the Council of Europe's European Committee of Social Rights and co-chair of IPES Food. He previously served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food from 2008 to 2014, and as a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights between 2015 and 2020. Prior to those appointments, he was Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, and he teaches at UC Louvain, Louvain-Neuve, Belgium, and at Sciences Po in Paris, France. So we're going to go over to Olivier now for his presentation. Thank you, Olivier.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Fergal, for this very long introduction, but putting things in perspective. I really enjoyed the exchange that we just heard on the panel involving Louise, Neil, and Helen, and particularly the discussion on the respective merits of universal approaches towards targeting child poverty and the more targeted approaches focused on households living on low incomes. What I would like to do here is perhaps try to locate the discussion in Ireland in a broader perspective, and see how the situation in Ireland and the fight. Sorry, this is the wrong. I think this is correct. I hope you can see the PowerPoint I'm using. What I would like to do in a few minutes is really put in perspective the situation of Ireland and the debate on how to combat child poverty. About 1/4 of children in Ireland are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. That figure has evolved slightly over the years, as discussed in his video message by the minister earlier on. And the situation in Ireland, as in many other European countries, is that children are more struck by poverty than adults, in particular because poverty is particularly important in households with children, particularly single-parent households, mostly headed by women. So poverty is mostly affecting children, affecting women more than men, and affecting single-parent households in particular. That is not something new. It is a characteristic of poverty in most European countries. And I would like to make on this situation and on what it calls for in terms of solutions, 3 remarks in particular. The first remark is that combating child poverty is essential to avoid the perpetuation of poverty from one generation to the next, because a child raised in poverty is a child who, as an adult, will be deeply disadvantaged and will not have by far the same life chances as other children. This is in fact what the EU Child Guarantee acknowledged in June 2021. As you know, the Council of the EU, the governments of member states agreed to this recommendation about school meals, adequate housing, adequate education, in order to break the vicious cycles that affect children in poverty. And I will return to this EU Child Guarantee, but I would simply like to note here that it recognized the importance of investing in combating child poverty as a means to break these vicious cycles. Because when children grow up in poverty, social exclusion, they face disadvantages in their ability to flourish, to develop. As a result, they struggle in order to achieve decent, high levels of education and to get a job. And they end up in the most precarious jobs, limiting their earning opportunities as adults. And we can picture these vicious cycles by showing how household poverty leads to poor nutrition, in turn making it more difficult for children to learn, leading them to perform poorly at school, which is one of the reasons for the early school dropout for children raised in poverty. And in turn, this results in these children having lower earnings as adults. In addition, children raised in poverty have to study in dwellings which are crowded, which are noisy, which are polluted. They face disproportionately more than others domestic violence, which of course makes it more difficult for them to study in the right conditions, explaining again low grades and school dropout. In addition, they may be less well equipped to use the internet in order to study better. It is for this reason that in all countries, we see that even for mathematics, which is in principle, one would think not connected to the possession of cultural capital and to having books around you in the home, even in mathematics, children in poverty are less able to perform well than children that are raised in higher income households. The situation of Ireland is described here. It is neither the best nor the worst case in this regard, but there is a very significant gap, as in other countries, between children depending on their socioeconomic status in their ability to perform well in mathematics. In addition, when you are a child raised in poverty, you have fewer access to extracurricular activities, to sports, to music lessons, and so on. And that results in a situation in which you have fewer networks on which to build. You have fewer contacts with nature, which explains why children in poverty, more than others, are affected by what Richard Louv calls nature deficit disorders, a difficulty to concentrate, to focus, because you don't have enough relationships with nature. And in addition, when you have fewer activities outside the school, you are not taught to aspire to something else and to seek inspiration from other role models than those that you find in your family, in your immediate surroundings. So these are a number of vicious cycles that children in poverty experience as a result of being poor. They face disadvantages that should be tackled and that require that we support households, families much better. It's important to do so also because income and wealth inequalities reduce social mobility. In other terms, the more inequalities persist in society, the less it will be easy for children to overcome the disadvantages of poverty. The hurdles they have to overcome, if you wish, are too important for them. And so it results in this being much more difficult for children in poverty to move beyond. This is one chart which is prepared by the OECD and illustrates how different countries from the OECD are ranked based on their social mobility or the social mobility they allow. Ireland, again, is not the worst country, but it performs less well than Denmark or other Scandinavian countries, in the sense that you need more generations in Ireland than in those Scandinavian countries to overcome the disadvantage that results from being raised in the lowest decile of the population, the 10% poorest group within the population. It takes about 5 generations in Ireland to overcome this disadvantage. It is better than what France or Germany achieve, but it is not as good as what Scandinavian countries achieve. The relationship between inequality and social mobility is sometimes referred to by economists as the Great Gatsby curve, which refers, of course, to the novel by Scott Fitzgerald, which describes this character who starts as a bootlegger in New York and ends up being part of the jet society, the elite in New York. But the story of the Great Gatsby, played on screen by Leonardo DiCaprio, is really non-typical. In most cases, in highly unequal societies, it is very difficult to overcome the disadvantages when you are raised in a low-income household. And this is what this chart shows. The position of Ireland is not the worst. In fact, Ireland has a relatively better score on social mobility than other countries with the same levels of inequality. But nevertheless, there is an important argument to be made in favor of combating inequalities more aggressively. It is the only way to be faithful to the ideal of equal opportunities. My second remark is that to strengthen social protection, we should address 2 issues. First, we should have tax systems that are generally progressive. If we look at how much tax systems reduce inequality, we can present that question in the form of this graph, and Ireland is at the very left end of this graph. It shows that to travel from market inequality, the result of how people make incomes on the market, to the inequality we achieve after people are taxed, after people receive social benefits, the difference is quite significant. Pensions explain part of the difference. So the first segment here is the impact of pensions on the rate of inequality. Taxes play an important role, although not quite as important as pensions in reducing inequalities. And then, of course, social transfers are extremely important. And the combination of the 3, pensions, taxes, and social transfers, explain the very significant difference between inequality before redistribution takes place by pensions, tax, and social policies, and the inequalities after those transfers have taken place. So the role of taxation is really important. The role of redistribution is very important, but it is important to realize that it will not suffice to legislate for progressive taxes and for generous social policies if we don't, basing ourselves on the experience of people in poverty, address the question of non-take-up of rights. And I dedicated a full report to the UN on this issue. It is very striking that people in poverty sometimes experience more than others obstacles to having access to certain forms of social protection, because it is difficult for them to fill in forms, because of the lack of information about what they are entitled to, because their situation is complex and changing very often, so that the rules are difficult to manipulate and to understand, and because they may be ashamed of claiming a right to benefit from certain forms of support. In fact, there has been a tendency in the past to look at non-take-up of rights as essentially the result of the beneficiary not doing the right things, not going to the appointments, not collecting the information, not overcoming his or her fear of stigma or humiliation. But really, the reason why the beneficiary are not always doing the right thing to claim their rights is largely because they face social services that routinely provide incomplete or incorrect advice, that sometimes discriminate or humiliate people in poverty who are seeking support. And that happens because the policymakers, the governments, often continue to send a message that social protection is a burden on society, that people should not be dependent on social support, that people should be activated to look for a job, and that it is their responsibility to move beyond or to graduate from social protection. And this discourse, which is blaming people in poverty for their condition, and which presents social protection as a burden on society, is one that may explain in large part the high rates of non-take-up that we still see. And then my third and final message is that although tax and transfer redistribution is hugely important in order to tackle poverty, it is also important to address the structural causes that explain the need to support people in poverty because of the way the market operates and because of the failure to invest enough in early childhood education and care. In other terms, post hoc, post-market redistribution should be complemented by in-market transformations and ex-ante approaches to equip people to succeed in the market. And here I would like to highlight the importance of in-work poverty in Europe, and Ireland is not an exception, although the rate of in-work poverty in Ireland is relatively low compared to other countries. In the EU, on average, it's about 1 in 10 workers who are at risk of poverty despite working. In Ireland, it's about half that proportion, it's about 5%. But nevertheless, low wages persist because of the importance of precarious and informal work, for example, in the building sector, in agriculture, because union rights are sometimes violated and unions not well equipped to negotiate for better wages, and because unemployment can be a problem, although it has been reduced quite significantly in Ireland over the past 15 years. Now, let me end with an emphasis on early childhood education and care and the benefits of this. We know from the work of the University of Chicago economist James Heckman that early childhood education and care is the best investment a society can make. And it is the return on investment is far more important when we invest early in the development of the child than when we invest later in the child's education. And the reason for this is very simple. If you invest in early childhood, you provide the child with an ability to learn better in later life. Learning is a cumulative process. If you have been able to develop the right cognitive abilities because of the context in which you were raised during your early years, you will find it much easier to succeed in preschool education, in primary school, and in secondary school. However, if you were not supported in early life, if you were during your first 3 years or your first 6 years before joining primary school in poverty without being well supported, you will be unable often to make up for that delay in development, and for that failure to have the vocabulary and the cognitive abilities that children who are better off have managed to collect. And so the findings of James Heckman are that early childhood and education and care has much higher returns on investment than if you delay investment in the child, and if you trust only the school, for example, to make up for the failure to support children during the early age. And that is why the EU Child Guarantee is so important. As you know, the Council of the EU adopted the recommendation on the EU Child Guarantee in June 2021, which includes a commitment to provide free early education and care, free education, free healthcare, and one healthy school meal per day, which should be free. And then there's also a commitment in this recommendation to improve access to healthy nutrition and adequate housing. The Child Guarantee is now monitored with national coordinators within each EU member state tasked with supervising implementation of an action plan to deliver on these promises. And I very much hope that further progress will be made based on this Child Guarantee and the commitments that are contained therein. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion, and I must apologize again for having been trapped in trains and our connections therefore having been disrupted as a result. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. That was very insightful overview. There's a lot of learnings to take from it. You've given us a very, I suppose, international comparative perspective. If you were to kind of look in the round, what do you think? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but what should be the priority focus for the government in our forthcoming budget, which is happening in October? So we're in a cycle where we'll be making our budget for 2026 at the moment, and there's lots of discussions going on around priorities and so on. So what do you think ought to be the priority?
Look, I think the starting point is really to see investing in combating child poverty as an investment, not as a cost. In all countries, there's a debate between what might be called the left hand and the right hand of government, the Ministry of Finance, that is particularly attentive to reducing public deficits and to maintaining a balanced public budget. And then the ministries of education, health, social protection, employment, who insist on social investment being prioritized. And I think that discussion is difficult because what appears to be a cost in the short term, investing in combating child poverty, is actually in the long term an investment with very high returns. And there are various calculations showing that in the midterm, in the long term, any euro invested in combating child poverty raises benefits that at least are calculated to amount to 7 euros. According to some calculations, may amount to 21, 22 euros, for a simple reason. It is that when you invest in combating child poverty early enough in the development of the child's abilities, you allow that child to learn better, to succeed better as a young adult, to achieve better at school and then in not only secondary, but also higher education. And that child, as an adult, will pay taxes, will earn more if he or she has been given an equal opportunity to succeed during the early stage of his or her development. So I think that is really what we should keep in mind. And I presented to the UN a report on combating the vicious cycles that perpetuate poverty from one generation to the next, a report very strongly informed by the views of people in poverty and what succeeds best. And that is really the key message I would like to make myself. And then finally, let me say one word about the very interesting exchange that took place on the panel discussion just before the panel discussion suspended in order to allow me to intervene. It was a discussion between the respective merits of targeting support to low-income households on the one hand, or having much more universal forms of support on the other hand. And usually universal approaches, as Fergal, you rightly noted, are considered promising because they don't create any sense of stigma or shame for people in poverty benefiting from more targeted support, because they are more popular with the wide public and with the taxpayers in particular, because they will be more willing, we are often told, to contribute to universal types of support, given that their children too will benefit. But in fact, what the polls show that we were just presented is that people are supportive of targeted support going to children in poverty. And the reason for this, I think, is largely because people understand that reducing inequalities, reducing child poverty in particular, is actually in the interest of all. And the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett on, starting with their 2009 book, The Spirit Level, shows very well how societies that reduce inequality, that reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, are societies that are better equipped to address the challenges they face, in part because the social fabric is better, because there's more trust between people, there is less violence, fewer teenage pregnancies, and so on. And so I think that is what intuitively we now are starting to understand. Now, the last point or question I still have is, of course, the question of non-take-up. The more you target on low-income households, on children in poverty, in order to make a more efficient use of the scarce resources that people like Neil have to manage, the more you risk under-inclusion, because targeting often means requiring that households, if they want to benefit from certain support schemes, have to provide evidence of the income they make. They have to fill in complex forms. They have to go through bureaucratic hurdles if they want to prove that they are deserving of support. And we have to be very attentive to this. In all European countries I could study in detail, I did not study in detail Ireland, but the problem of non-take-up of rights is a huge problem. Very often, households are discouraged from applying for certain forms of support because of the complexity of the procedures, because of the difficulty of processing complex information, and because of the delays incurred between the moment you start your application and the moment you receive support. So I'm sure that in Ireland you are very attentive to this question, and that is, I think, the risks of exceedingly targeted approaches that impose additional administrative hurdles in seeking support.
Thank you, Olivier. And I think Niall will be happy with your framing of his budget ask as an investment rather than a cost. I think that whole approach to social return on investment, one of the action learning sets, we had an event yesterday on child poverty, and one of the action learning sets from Maria O'Dwyer, who is the coordinator of our what we call our prevention and early intervention network, is looking at that idea. And I think it's something we need to engage our Department of Public Expenditure and Reform on. I think there's a persuasive argument to be made there. I'm going to abuse my position as chair now and just speak to you a bit myself before going to the rest of the panel. But I was, and this is a big question now, I was interested in the slide you presented with the primary, secondary, and tertiary, and then almost looking at that in conjunction with the slide you presented on Heckman. And in the work I do with family resource centres in Ireland, so family resource centres, I suppose for the best possible description, if you could think of a layer below that, the primary care that you had on your slide, and the problem you spoke about in relation to uptake of services and uptake of rights. The methodology we would be trying to adopt is what we call a human rights-based approach to community development and family support across the life course. So it's maybe trying to flip that kind of perception of the citizen as a recipient of services, but in fact more as an active agent of change in their own lives, as a participant rather than a recipient. That's even reflected in the governance of these family resource centres, where the community themselves are running a company essentially limited by guarantee with charitable status, so they're directly participating in the governance of the supports they receive. So it's just, to me, and we often use the Hardaker model in Ireland that would present that kind of as a pyramid, that same slide you had. So to me, I know a pyramid doesn't work without its base, or if you prop up a pyramid without the base layer, it falls down. So that kind of investment in community-based family support and their participation themselves in their receipt of very necessary primary, secondary and tertiary services. And I very much welcome and agree with the Heckman approach and in some ways the co-locating of that early years. And we're looking at the possibility of a fully public model of early years care and education in Ireland. And to me, what would be important is the co-location of that with those other types of, and I'm not saying only family resource centres, but many family resource centres co-locate early years care and education alongside other wraparound supports in terms of parenting and family support. And childcare, I agree, is very important. I think school is very important, free school meals. I always have a sort of balance there around displacing family and family participation and family life. I think the place to have your main meal of the day is around a dinner table with your parents. And I think parents who don't want to put their kids in childcare and want to take longer off of work need to be empowered to do so as well. So I know that's kind of a two-parter. It's that whole participation in services and the kind of caution of displacement of family and community and place-based approaches when you take a very service delivery approach. Have you any remarks on that?
Two brief remarks, perhaps. Thank you very much indeed, Fergal. The first one is a rights-based approach is really important because it changes the relationship between service providers and beneficiaries. Rather than beneficiaries benefiting from some form of public charity, which they are ashamed of depending on, with the sense that they are a burden on society, which is really disempowering. Once you explain that this is something they are entitled to as citizens or residents who matter to the community, and that if they are denied support, they have access to claims mechanisms and can file complaints. That is empowering, that rebalances the relationship, that allows beneficiaries to escape largely the stigma, the shame that is associated with depending on social support. So I think it is indeed extremely important, and it's important also because a rights-based approach is the best way to avoid mistargeting, what I call non-take-up of rights, resulting from the multiplication of administrative conditions or hurdles that result in people not claiming their rights. The reason is that if you provide people with rights they claim before independent bodies, if they are excluded, they will complain. They will seek to be supported if they have been told that they have a right to be supported and if they fall under the right conditions. And then you mentioned rightly in referring to the family resource centers, the role of participation. It is absolutely clear to me that if you organize ways in which community members can be involved in setting up a scheme, not only will the scheme be much better informed by the challenges households face and the difficulties they encounter, so it will be more efficient. But in addition, people will feel a sense of ownership and will be better informed about the conditions under which they can receive support. So I think both a rights-based approach and an approach based on the participation of people in poverty are ways to reduce the risk of non-take-up of rights.
Thank you, Olivia. So I want to give our panel now, patiently been listening to your presentation, the opportunity maybe to give any reflections you might have. So Helen, have you any reflections on Olivia?
Thank you very much, Olivier. Yes, so I just to say first that it really chimes with some research that we published earlier in the week, that intergenerational poverty piece that we saw, that people who grew up in poverty were much more likely to experience poor health in adulthood, low employment rates, low educational attainment. So I think really that the importance of investment and that really pays off, I think is a really important point. I'd also, yes, I endorse that the importance of investment in early childcare and education. And we've done some work with our wonderful Growing Up in Ireland study where we can follow the children through, and we really see that we found that children who were maybe had a home learning environment that wasn't as rich really benefited most from the participation in early education and care. There's been a lot of investment in it, but in Ireland, but we are still have a private model, and I think what's really again clear from the literature is that the quality of the care is really crucial in terms of it being, you know, having those beneficial effects. So I think, you know, we really need to look at that. We don't have a good sense of that at the moment, I think. But I think that public model, when you look at it comparatively, the public model have the highest quality of childcare. So I think moving towards that is important from the quality perspective as well.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Louise, have you anything you'd like to say?
I would, and it's possibly a question more than a statement, if that's okay. I agree with everything you said about the investment in early care and education. It's so important. But I suppose one of the concerns we have is over here we are involved in research called the Minimum Essential Standard of Living, and it breaks down the costs of what it is to support a child and at different levels. So when we look at the essential needs of children, our social protection covers more than 100% of the needs of a preschool and an infant. When we get to primary school age children, it supports 88% of their needs. And when we get to second level, so from 12 years old upwards, it only supports 64% of their essential needs. Now, so there's this kind of ongoing debate then that, well, we need to invest in younger years children because we get better return. However, my fear is we know there's higher costs with older children, teenage years. By investing in younger years, are we at risk of leaving this generation of children who did not get the investment when they were younger, and now, you know, as teenagers at a very vulnerable age in their lives, they're being socially excluded, and 64% of their needs only are being met, which puts a huge burden on parents to try to make up that deficit if they're too reliant on social protection. So how do we get that balance right of there may not be the better return on investment by investing in teenagers. However, morally, I would believe it's the right thing to do.
Olivia, just before you answer that, and keeping Louise's question and just kind of making it a two-parter, we had a question from the audience from Siobhan from the Children's Rights Alliance, and Siobhan was highlighting one of the issues raised by the Child Poverty Youth Advisory Group at yesterday's Summit on Child Poverty and Wellbeing. So this is a group of young people who have been advising the Department of Taoiseach's Child Poverty and Wellbeing Unit. And I just putting it in because it's sort of related, although a distinct question about how to best address inequalities in schools, considering the link, and it goes to your slide on a vicious cycle, the link to wealth inequality. So we have a lot of measures in Ireland. Whilst not primary and secondary school is nominally kind of free for most people, or people who choose to go to a regular school, there's a lot of add-ons, I suppose, something that's framed as a voluntary contribution by many schools that's used to kind of pay for various additional costs that the school can't cover from its core funding. So those kind of hidden costs, I suppose, have a particular impact as well on families. So I think that's related to Louise's question. So if you could just kind of consider the two of those together. Thanks, Olivia.
Well, thank you very much, Fergal. I'm not sure how I can really answer the question of Louise, which is under the guise of the question, a very important remark, but I really have nothing to comment, in part because I'm not familiar enough with the situation of secondary schools in Ireland and whether more should be done with regard to children from low-income backgrounds attending secondary school. But I would like to seize the opportunity of the question of Siobhan to say the following. Just like we have, since many years, been discussing what an inclusive school can mean for children with disabilities, we must reflect on what an inclusive school should mean for children from low-income backgrounds. And the question of costs, including hidden costs, is one part of a much broader question here, because what I find is that in many schools, children from low-income backgrounds are bullied, are harassed, they don't have the right codes, and therefore they will not succeed well at school because the teachers are not sensitized to the need to take their particular concerns or situation into account. And sometimes we have even instances of povertyism that remain unaddressed in the way lessons are taught or activities in the school are managed. Early school dropout from children from low-income backgrounds is in part explained by the fact that we have not been reflecting enough on what it takes for a school to be truly inclusive. And what this means is essentially to value the lived experience of children from low-income households as equally worthy of consideration, equally rich in class discussions as the knowledge of the kids who are better off and can, for example, in September, speak about the exotic destinations that they've been able to visit when they travel by plane during the summer. And so I think it's really important to define schools as places which will be really valuing diversity from all parts of the population, and conveying the message to children who come from low-income backgrounds that they have something valuable to contribute to class discussions in particular. So that is what I would like to say. I completely understand that your question was about costs, including the hidden costs that parents are sometimes asked to contribute to. But I think the question of inclusive education goes beyond. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I mean, not to make it too much about family resource centres, but we have lots of conversations about that life course approach. So I think Louise is right. You know, we need to make sure that a commitment to prevention and early intervention, an understanding of the importance of the 0 to 6 category, and the importance of investing there. It's an investment that needs to continue throughout the life course. So we don't want to kind of pit age cohorts of young people or indeed adults against each other. So, and the whole kind of neuroscience that informs that argument also says that neuroplasticity occurs throughout the life course, and there are many opportunities to support through our youth work. And there was a lot of discussion over the week in relation to targeted youth work as well, and youth development. So I think you're quite right that, and on into vulnerable adults and older people and so on, all these cohorts, and a rights-based approach again, I think helps us to think in that way. Now, I'm conscious you didn't have a chance to comment on Olivia's presentation yet, so just wondering if you had any reflections.
Just to say thank you, Olivier. I thought it was excellent, really considered, and you've brought together a huge strand of research in a very concise and very clear manner. So we are very passionate in making the argument that social welfare and social protection is an investment. We're very conscious, particularly given, we've always believed that, but we saw it really apparently during the COVID pandemic, the role that social protection played in terms of social cohesion and adherence, particularly to the measures designed to protect our health service, and without having that social cohesion, we would have had significantly higher mortality rates, and social protection was to the fore as part of that measure. And we're very conscious that we completely agree, Olivier, in terms of the points you've made, in terms of that investment point. We're also very aware that Ireland, without our system of social transfers, is one of the most unequal societies in Europe and the OECD. And I would generally dread to think, without the investment of the 26 billion that we invest this year in Irish society, what our society would look like. It's beyond, I can't imagine it, to be honest. And that's the real important, the value of a social welfare system, that redistribution, as you correctly pointed out, but it's giving people decency. It's not just the essentials. It's about giving them the opportunity, as you discussed, and you seeing the net benefit of contributing, maximizing their potential. And as you said, that investment, the return on that investment is very significant. So just to say, fully acknowledge and fully agree with that. And thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thanks very much. And just building on that point, and I think this is a direct quote. Our Taoiseach, Olivier, our Prime Minister, was speaking yesterday at our Child Poverty and Wellbeing Summit, and I think he said targeted measures yield universal benefit. So just come back to what you said, because we briefly touched on it on the Spirit Level book, and I think there's a second edition of that book out recently. So really we have a sustained body of evidence over a long period of time that more equal societies do better economically, that trickle-down economics is hopefully a relic of Thatcherism, and that we ought to be embracing wanting to be a more equal society on the logic that that will actually help us to do better economically. And we're having another event on Monday in relation to child protection and welfare, and there's also a lot of emerging evidence globally that the rates of child abuse and neglect in countries that are more equal and that have well-developed social protection systems, and actually another level of targeting, which is done in some states in the US, surprisingly, is targeting income payments to families who are on the edge of or within the child protection and welfare system, and supports for kinship care, for example, which are, I would argue, somewhat underdeveloped still here, where, you know, if a child is received into the care of the state, a foster care will receive a level of payment, but a kinship carer who takes a child on outside of the formal care system won't receive the same level of payment. So I just wondered if you could address that kind of idea of equality, linking it to the economic success.
Well, I think it's important to emphasize the economic benefits of investing in quality early childhood education and care, absolutely. However, the economic benefits are not, of course, all that matters. And what we also should emphasize is that there is now, within the United Nations and elsewhere, including in the OECD in particular since quite a few years, a growing awareness that well-being is not just about economic growth and improved purchasing power. Now, of course, it's strange in an event on poverty to say this and to introduce this nuance, but I think my message is that improving the material conditions for the benefit of low-income households and the children in particular, to support their early development, is not a substitute for rethinking how society looks at poverty and how the knowledge of people in poverty is valued, and how they feel not ashamed and dependent and supported, but blamed for their condition, but rather as people whose experience is one we can learn from, because they are the real experts of how to combat poverty and how to overcome the obstacles they face. And that is a message politicians should deliver very explicitly. It is, I think, really important for social cohesion that we not limit ourselves to those material dimensions. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. We have a question now from the audience, which is for our panel. So one of the key slides in Olivier's presentation described how it would take, in Ireland, it would take four to five generations to address systemic inequalities, whereas Denmark, Norway and Finland were closer to 2 to 3 generations. So just from the panel's point of view, what do you think a priority action could be for this government to bridge that gap for children and families, so to speed up that ability, that pathway out of poverty? Helen, I'm going to go with you first.
Yeah, so just drawing on the work we did at the SRI, so we were looking at, you know, how childhood poverty influences later outcomes, and tried to look a bit at the channels through which that worked, and education was the major lever. Also then occupational or employment after that. So, but I think in terms of breaking the cycle, it's that investment in education and preventing preventing those inequalities widening and reproducing. I mean, that's how both advantage and disadvantage is reproduced. So I think we also need to probably look a bit at the other side of the equation of how the advantaged in society are able to, you know, leverage their position to make sure that their children are doing well. So I think that's a big societal question as well, because, you know, people don't like to give up their privileges. So
we talk a lot about income transfer, and I find it curious. We don't, like, when you think about income as and capital, there's a lot written on the theory of social capital, but we don't really talk about an equivalent redistribution system in relation to social capital.
Yes, and one of my colleagues had a article during the week which was talking about aspirations and those inequalities as well, and found that, you know, that when children from lower income households were going into secondary, usually there was an increase in aspiration from their parents, but that wasn't seen to the same extent for the lower income children, and that they really benefited then from having greater supports from teachers and having that you know, institutional level support. If they're not, if their parents haven't gone to third level education and have had those advantages, then, you know, you don't have that, as I say, the social capital, cultural capital to draw on. So then it becomes really important that children have the guidance supports within schools, or even the, you know, the interactions with teachers that are positive, because that makes a huge difference in children's outcomes. So yeah, I think the education is hugely important. Obviously, you mentioned briefly the health, because that was another channel through which the inequalities are reproduced. So I think that's really important, that we address those health inequalities and implement the Sláinte care, I think, is important.
Absolutely. Louise, if you have any reflection on that idea of the number, which I was new to me, actually, the comparative piece about the number of generations to get out of poverty.
That was new to me as well. And I was listening to Helen talking about education, and of course that's so important. But I was going to add in the aspiration, and she took the words out of my mouth. But I do think it's really important, the poverty of aspiration, and there is poverty of aspirations when you are living in poverty. And it's important that we give people that. And I know it's something that Children's Rights Alliance focus on a lot, and I possibly don't as much, but because I'm always talking about income supports, but I do think it's really important that, of course, there needs to be income support so you can look outside yourself, because if you're struggling in poverty, you cannot see outside the box. But to have that cultural impact of being able to have access to museums, to art galleries, to playgrounds that are suitable for your age, and to have that aspiration is so important. And I'm going to give a really small example of a lived experience that I went through, and how your brain locks in when you can't see the tree from the woods. And it was when I had a young child, a baby in arms, and I needed to go into Dolphin's house to access child maintenance. And I could not figure out, couldn't figure out how to get the bus onto the buggy, because you had to hold her. She was too young to fold the buggy up. And I thought, I can't get onto the bus, and I couldn't see how I could get out of poverty to go into Dolphin House to get child maintenance. If it was raining, I couldn't sit her on the ground. And this was this biggest barrier that I could not overcome. And for weeks this was going on, and I was trapping myself into poverty, could not see it. Something happened and I got angry, and I went, I don't care if I have to stand at that bus stop for 3 hours until I see a kind woman who'll hold the baby while I fold the buggy and get on the bus. And I did that one day. I got in, I walked into Dolphin House, I got my summons, I came out of there thinking, I have won a marathon. I was just so pleased and happy. And as I walked out the door, I went, oh no, I forgot I have still to get the bus home. And like that, my mind switched and I went, hold on, I could just walk down and get the train. In those 3 or 4 weeks beforehand, not once had I come up with the solution of the train, because I was trapped in a problem and I was locked in poverty. But I think when you lift that up, you can see other things. And that's what happened to me. And when I talk about aspirations, a parent cannot give aspiration to their child when they can't see beyond how will I put bread on the table tomorrow. And I think that's what, so while I haven't focused, I do think we need to start with income supports, and income supports then leads to educational and aspirations, and then you have a real chance of breaking the cycles.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'll come to you in a second now, but one reflection I don't want to say, I don't want to move on in case I forget, is just around, go back to the rights-based approach. I would wonder to what extent discrimination is a factor in the speed with which cohorts can move forward within generations. We've done a lot of work recently with traveller organisations in Ireland, and I'm thinking of Martin and Pavey Point, and a conversation I had with him. So, you know, is beyond income and beyond socioeconomic status, is there discrimination, and on the grounds, and I know that it's been looked at the moment around the legislation around we're part of an alliance called Add to 10th around looking at socioeconomic as a grounds for discrimination. So I'm just wondering, could that be a factor in people's ability to move out of poverty, that they're being held within through discrimination, both traveller population
yeah, I mean,
and
without a doubt, Virgil, because I ended up living in poverty because of a marriage breakdown. But what I did have was social capital and education, so I was able to lift myself out of it. If I had been a traveller woman, or if I had always grown up in poverty, I would not have had the skills. So it's not that I was brilliant getting out. I had social capital that others didn't have, and didn't face the same discrimination. So yeah, you know, I'm not saying that my path was easier, but I'm just acknowledging that I lived that bleak prison that you can't see out, and I had the key out, but I don't know how much more difficult it would have been if I had other barriers.
Absolutely, yeah, it's interesting. Niall, if you have any reflections on that, because obviously you are, you know, the civil service are the permanent government, so no disrespect to our politicians, but if it's taking not only a couple of terms of government, but a couple of generations to actually lift people out of poverty, that's quite a challenge, I suppose.
It is, but kind of, you look back where Ireland has come. So, you know, I think the Taoiseach's op-ed or article in the Irish Indo yesterday referred to Donegal O'Malley, and he was the generation that was able to complete primary school and secondary school on foot of that, and the avenues that opened. Mike Ryan yesterday at the seminar said something very, very similar. Very large family. If it wasn't for free education, he wouldn't be there standing there addressing us and all that he has achieved. So I'd have to agree with Helen that education is that gateway. If you look at Ireland in the 1980s, and look at us relative to Europe, look at that journey that we've come on, even relative to our nearest neighbour. It's been a transformation. Now, the trick and the issue that we have to focus on is not everyone has benefited from that transformation. Society as a whole has hugely transformed. So we have to focus on providing those income supports that Louise said to ensure other people that don't have the same opportunities that many of us have at the moment have access to be able to bridge that gap. So I don't really have anything else to add to the incredible testimony we've heard from both Louise and Helen on this. I do think that is what they both said is the answer.
I think it's a challenging one to communicate the good news story. There has been progress from generation to generation. We want to be positive and we want to see that, but there's this kind of cohort left behind as well, and that's the challenge, is to kind of make the benefits that Irish society is experiencing available to all and accessible to all. Okay. All right, we're coming now towards the end of our session. I'm just going to see if we've had any more questions from the audience. Oh yeah, we've had some comments. We still have Olivier on the line, have we? Yeah, okay. Just a comment from the audience. Louise, you are fantastic. Your lived experience. Thank you for using your voice, especially for those who don't have a voice. So just wanted to read that out to you. And we'll go for a very final comment from Olivier. Olivier, now I'm throwing this at you as well, and this just kind of preempting your final comment, but Mike Ryan, who's I think retires today. He was at our event yesterday, the Child Poverty Summit, and I think he retires today as Deputy Director of the World Health Organization. But he made a very interesting join up yesterday around climate change and inequality as well as a global issue. I'm just wondering, is that something that intersects with all of this as well? Does and will, and should we be concerned that the impact of climate change will have a greater impact on those who are experiencing poverty or in deprivation globally? But is that something relevant to us here in Ireland as well? Under general comment, I should say, give you an open opportunity to comment as well before we close.
Thank you very much indeed, Fergal, for this question, or more precisely, to the person who authored the question. There is now, in a growing number of countries, a reflection that is taking place as to whether we need to add to the life risks against which Social Security should protect the risks associated with climate change. We have traditionally, in the instruments of the International Labour Organization, for example, a number of risks, 9 in total, which are maternity, unemployment, disability, sickness, old age, and so on. And social security systems have been designed in order to protect people from economic insecurity resulting from these risks. Must we add one additional risk, which is, for example, to have your home flooded and have to move to another location, or to be unable to pay the costs of heating if it becomes much more expensive as a result of the introduction of a carbon tax. I studied this in a report to the UN, and I concluded that, in fact, if social protection systems, as they have been designed, are well financed and function correctly to protect people in poverty from economic insecurity, they should in principle suffice. And the report addresses how then can we ensure that social protection is better financed. We have globally a great interest in climate finance and in how to support low-income countries in particular to adapt and mitigate climate change. The best way to adapt to climate change is really to protect people by strengthened social protection schemes. And so the report calls for introducing or including social protection as part of climate adaptation strategies that can be financed by the various climate funds and loss and damage funds that have been established in order to support low-income countries' efforts. There's been a report in Belgium, just recently published a few days ago, concluding that there is a need to provide specific protection against climate change related risks, in part because private insurance mechanisms will not be sufficient to protect people's homes, for example, that are affected by flooding. So I think the jury is still out on this, and there is certainly a need to discuss this in the future. It's an ongoing discussion, and it all depends on whether private insurers, by being able to reinsure themselves in the face of major disasters related to climate change, will be able to support households without these households having to pay exorbitant premiums, as may well be the case in the future.
Okay. Thanks very much, Olivier. I think we're ready to close now. If we've no further comments, we've no further questions from the audience. So on behalf of us all here today, I just want to extend a thank you to Minister Derek O'Leary for preparing an address for today's event. Thank you also to our keynote, Olivier de Schutter, who made a great effort, I think, to be with us today, joining us from abroad and also while on the road. A very helpful and thought-provoking address. So for Irish stakeholders and decision makers, I think it's very interesting to hear that international perspective and the comparative perspective, especially in the lead up to Budget Day. To our panelists, Dr. Niall Egan, Louise Bayliss, and Professor Helen Russell, joining me here today. Thank you very much for your contributions and for your insights and for your discussions. On behalf of the Children's Rights Alliance team, I want to extend a thank you to the partners to End Child Poverty Week, Community Foundation Ireland, and the Catherine Howard Foundation, and in particular our hosts here today, the Fidelis Foundation, who've made this event, today's hybrid event, possible. I want your support has been invaluable, instrumental in End Child Poverty Week. So as a board member of the Children's Rights Alliance, I want to very much thank those people. And I just want to finish by thanking everybody who joined us online today. I know many of you are very busy, you're very interested in this topic, you've taken time out of your day to join us in this, I suppose, community of practice and to discuss these issues. So thank you very much and goodbye.